Hi, I'm Marjorie Morrison.
And this is Patrick Kennedy.
And you are listening to the Psych Hub podcast, The Future of Mental Health. We are so excited today for another episode of The Future of Mental Health. Today we have the incredible Courtney Billington, who is the president at Janssen Neuroscience. Courtney's had over a 28-year career at J&J, started out in the supply chain. He is very passionate about military mental health, hiring veterans. He served in the Army and was in Operation Desert Storm. He received his bachelor's in engineering at West Point, and he was named 2019 Top Black in Healthcare. He lives in New Jersey in the greater New York City area, and we are just really excited to have Courtney with us today. So Courtney, welcome to the show.
Marjorie and Patrick, thank you for having me. It's a privilege to be on the show. And actually, I thought maybe you made a mistake when you invited me to be on the show.
Never. You are an incredible person, and you are painting a new way on the future of mental health, more than practically anyone, and coming at it from a really, really different lens. So as we get started, I know that most of our listeners have heard of your parent company, Johnson & Johnson. But for those that might not know what Janssen is, can you speak a little bit more about some of the innovations you're working on and really what is Janssen Neuroscience?
Yeah, sure. So like you said, most people know Johnson & Johnson as the most broadly based healthcare company in the world. And within it, we have three sectors: pharmaceuticals, consumer, med device. Our pharmaceutical business is branded under the name of Janssen. So all of our pharmaceutical companies around the globe are under the name of Janssen. And we represent about 55% of all of Johnson & Johnson's revenues. And we're in 6 major therapeutic areas that we cover. And neuroscience is one of those 6 areas, and I would selfishly say it's the best therapeutic area that we have within Janssen.
As you know, I've been a big champion for research, neuroscience research, and it's a very difficult part of research because, of course, the brain is the most complex organ of the body, and to try to suss out new therapeutics has been a challenge for decades and decades. And, it's probably an easier thing to go on the the simpler of the, biomedical challenge diseases, so to speak, rather than take on the complexity of neuroscience. But maybe in a general sense, could you talk about kind of that?
Patrick, you bring up some great points. And when I think about it, first of all, at Janssen, our focus is to transform the lives of patients who have high unmet medical needs. So our focus and where we look to differentiate ourselves is really to focus in on science and transformational science. And so the hurdle is indeed higher. And that's why I think we've also been and stayed in this space of brain health for more than 60 years, right? And if I look back first and talk a little bit about our heritage, where Dr. Paul Janssen, who discovered one of the early medications to treat adults who were living with schizophrenia more than 60 years ago, that treatment transformed a disease that when someone was diagnosed, they were committed to an institution for the rest of their life. And if I fast forward through the number of innovations that have happened, during that time, that disease transforms now where we have adults living with schizophrenia who work side by side with us. They have families. It has truly changed their lives. And if I think more broadly to your question about kind of what's happening in neuroscience, we are seeing a great renaissance in innovation. So the great thing is science of the brain. We've learned much more over the years. And so we are becoming more effective at identifying new treatments, but it's very, very expensive. to do that. And as you mentioned, I'll use one statistic. If you think about it, in 2019, the National Institute of Health spent more than $6 billion on research for cancer, as you mentioned. During that same time, they spent about $3 billion on mental health and diseases of the brain. So you even look where the investment and the money is. And as you mentioned, some companies, many other pharmaceutical companies and other healthcare companies have left this space because of the difficulty and the challenges. We've been fortunate to double down and stay committed, and focus on the science because patients have really been our guide. And we recognize that there is such a high unmet need. And we have focused and said we need to really identify treatments that can make a difference.
Could you talk a little bit about the difference in taking kind of that one size fits approach that's currently our model of regulatory approval versus kind of what the future holds in terms of, segmenting people based upon, their genetic profile and metabolomic and everything else, phenomic, that would really decipher them as a differentiated population for whom, a particular medication would work for them that may not work for everyone else. Could you kind of go into that? Because I think it'd be great interest to our listeners.
Sure. I think, you've touched on a number of key things. And I would say that the big driver of that, technology and the advancements in science have really enabled a lot of the things that you mentioned to occur. So even when we think about, first of all, better understanding of the brain, better understanding of causes of disease, or either symptoms that people suffer from day in and day out, we have a much, much better understanding of that. And as you mentioned, because of the different physiology that each of us has as individuals, different cultures, different races, ethnicities, so on and so forth, we have grown to recognize that you need different treatment options to meet the needs of our different makeup as individuals. And so as a result, because of the advances in science, we've been able to, and also the knowledge of the genome, we've been able to target disease in a much, much better way than we ever have been in the past. And if I think about, let's take as an area, depression, for years and years with many of the treatments that are available and had been available for decades, the SSRIs and the SNRIs that are out there, treating receptors that we kind of focused on for, almost 100 years ago. Now there's much greater understanding and much greater targets to where we're just beginning to see new mechanisms of action to either target disease in a very different way than we ever used to. And we no longer peanut butter spread and say, hopefully this works for you. Now we're able to align with biomarkers, better diagnostics, to where we can identify a population and frankly, have a better understanding if a particular treatment is going to work for a patient or not, right? And so as a result of that, having a much greater understanding, we can then provide better solutions for patients going forward.
I just want to add something because, obviously pharmaceutical industry in general really gets knocked, to say the least, on the cost of medications, but a lot of that being driven by the high cost of trying to come up with that, medication to fit all sizes. And conceivably, we could help reduce the cost of the big trials that have to take place in order to do these one-size-fits-all approaches if we have much more narrowly focused trials on those individuals with these certain subtypes or kind of genetic ID that might be a much better match for a particular type of therapeutic, because it's ostensibly that would not require you to do the big trial. you do it to see whether it works in your designated subtype. And of course, your market would be a whole lot smaller too.
Right.
But it would change fundamentally the whole approach between the regulatory environment and the pharmaceutical industry, and change the whole cost infrastructure, if you will.
Yeah. Because I mean, we're in 100% agreement that our healthcare system, the development of pharmaceuticals, we need to take advantage of the advances in technology. So on one hand, I'm talking about all of these great innovations that we have, but when you look at it, drug development has not fundamentally changed in 60, 70 years. So when you think about that, the way that we do clinical trials and many of the requirements, they remain unchanged, even though we have significant advances like those that you pointed out. And so we do need to do reforms, and as you mentioned, the pharmaceutical industry takes, oftentimes quite a bit of criticism for, pricing and different things, but it's a part of the system. And as you look at, we agree that the system needs to be reformed, but it can't just be fixing one small piece. Because if you just say, hey, pharmaceutical industry, reduce all of your prices, do all of that, we also need to make sure that we're able to continue to fund innovation and create the value that we started off talking about. And if I think about it, part of this, I'm with Johnson & Johnson actually now 30 years. And if I reflect back, I talked about the transformation of schizophrenia. But when I first started with Johnson & Johnson back in 1991, I played sports. And I remember when Magic Johnson announced that he had been diagnosed with HIV. And I think all of us would agree back then, we all kind of felt, oh my gosh, Magic Johnson, when you look at it, people who were diagnosed with HIV and AIDS at that time had about a 2-year life expectancy. 30 years. Now, fast forward 30 years, and the innovations in science and the pharmaceuticals that are out there to treat this disease, it has been changed from a disease that actually people had a 2 to 3 year life expectancy to now where it's a chronic disease that people can live, and 30 years later, Magic Johnson is doing all kinds of great stuff, right? He's a phenomenal businessman and he's fitter than I am, right? So when you think about it, it wouldn't have happened without the ability to fund innovation and come up with phenomenal science to change disease that exists. And we need to be able to make sure we protect that, as we look forward, because diseases are going to change. They're going to morph. We see in the current pandemic, even as coronavirus continues to mutate, we cannot just rest on what treatment worked a year ago. We've got to continue to make sure we advance and understand where diseases are going to mutate to in the future.
Well, to your HIV point, the activists at the time knew it was life or death. And they got so involved, they got FDA to look at novel ways of treatment so as to have these combined therapies.
Right.
That was a whole new way for FDA to think about approving molecules. In neuroscience, as you know, we don't have that mobilized advocacy because our constituency, aside from being kind of marginalized and discriminated against, and just doesn't have, they're often so disabled and their families are so filled with shame because of stigma. It really prevents a partner really for the biomedical research side from going to FDA and saying, you really need to shape up here. There's all these things on the table we'd like to see you do, and you need to do it because you can't do that as the drug company, but we could do it as the advocates.
Correct.
And I just need to point that out for our listeners that we were able to expedite treatment for HIV because the advocates were there to demand it. And we're in a different scenario with those with serious mental illness.
Well, and you mentioned about partnering, and I think it's so important. And that's why we partner with Psych Hub, right? For the great work that you do and the information that you provide to educate. If I think about, again, back to reflecting on these last 30 years, the knowledge and information of patients, caregivers, consumers on where they have grown to from when I started in this industry to today, we have a significantly more informed, engaged, and involved population than we ever have. And you're right, in mental health, we do need to have stronger advocates. We need to be able to get, greater legislation, greater policy, greater support, because the diseases that we treat are often invisible. And unfortunately, we suffer from that invisibility at times to where we don't get the same type of support, even with the prevalence that serious mental illnesses have across this country.
Could I ask you, speaking about invisible wounds, I mean, I think of invisible wounds of war, and you've been such a champion for your fellow veterans. Talk a little bit about the phenomena of the fact that we really talked about these as invisible wounds of war, post-traumatic stress, and traumatic brain injury. And yet our response, I mean, next to the burden of these challenges, was invisible. I mean, it really, I never saw us take the concerted action I thought as a nation we were going to take, given all the publicity around the tragedy of suicide numbers and of course the impact of our understanding on traumatic brain injury. But could you talk about that invisible thing coming from the military vantage point, and with this being the signature wound of these recent wars?
Yes.
What that means to you, because I think our listeners really need to understand how that invisibility really does affect our response.
Yeah. Patrick, I would say, as a veteran myself and also a leader in healthcare, it's probably one of the areas that I'm most disappointed in the lack of advancement and the lack of positive impact that we've had. Frankly, there is so much more that we could do and that we're not doing. So first and foremost, I do look at, there are a number of organizations out there that are doing good things. So don't get me wrong, I'm not negating that. But when you think about the number of veterans who choose to serve our country, and they sacrifice so much, that because of the nature of 20-year wars and other things that have gone on, and where either they've suffered from traumatic brain injury or TBI, unfortunately, the treatment options have not been great, and the responses have not been great. And we know the statistics around veteran suicide and things of that nature, and we really have not significantly changed those statistics. And so we are underperforming and underserving those heroes who served us best and the most, and we need to do a better job than what we're doing. And I would say that, and again, it's back to the point around mental health and the need to have a stronger voice. We need to have more people like yourself who are pushing the need for mental health parity and improving legislation and protecting this class. Because even, when you think about some of the legislation that's out there, there have been a number of folks who are looking at reforms to change the laws that protect this class of people who have serious mental illnesses, and they're looking to actually further roll back mechanisms that even support this population that we're actually saying is underserved. So, when I look at it at a time when we should be actually investing more, there is more scrutiny to even underinvest. So that piece needs to change. And I would say Johnson & Johnson and Janssen, we look to do our part. We recognize that we can't do it alone. We recognize there are things we can do even better, but we are convening. We're committed in this space. We partner with others who are getting the message out. We participate with large veteran service organizations like I serve on the board of governors for the USO. We have strategic partnerships with Wounded Warriors, Travis Manion Foundation, a number of different great organizations who represent these veterans who have done so much, but also need more support. And so with that, it is critical that we do galvanize ourselves and almost form stronger coalitions to demand better than what our veterans are receiving today.
Well, we know, Courtney, if one of our veterans was ever captured by the enemy in Afghanistan, Iraq, or anywhere in this world, we would send our special forces to go get them back, because you know what? That's how we roll in America. We don't leave our soldiers behind, but in a very like-minded way, we leave them behind on the battlefield when they come home in body, but not in mind, because of their suffering these signature wounds of war. And then we don't send in the special forces to get them when they're isolated in their little apartments without a job, because we don't do proper support after they leave the service. We abandon their families, and they're living in substandard conditions after fighting for our freedom. And it's almost as if we've left them on the battlefield. And frankly, their disabilities are the enemy's, the impact of the enemy's assault on them. It's a deliberate, strategic attack on our brains. These enemies knew with these IED devices they were going to hit our brains, and they were going to take out our soldiers through this TBI. And I am just shocked and disappointed, like you, that we never took this as a moment to really double down on traumatic brain injury for our veterans, but understood that our veterans are all Americans, because all Americans get traumatic brain injury. And we could have, like in every other area of medical endeavor, we could have done it for our veterans, but like everything else, our veterans would have been doing it for all of our people at the same time, because of the benefits of that research to everybody else. Could you just maybe talk a little bit about that idea of trying to get bigger kind of cohorts of patients who are willing to be part of these trials, so that we can better understand how to, intervene in the ways that we need to help not only our veterans, but our civilians as well?
Sure. Unfortunately, I think some of it gets back to a little bit of our history, and in some cases where there was a loss of trust, right? If I think about, there are 1.7 million veterans who received treatment in a VA mental health specialty during 2018. So that's a large population, right? And frankly, I applaud, some of the improvements that are being made in the VA. My father was treated in the VA. He was a veteran as well. And so, but I look at some of the improvements, and we need to continue on that journey. But, the unfortunate circumstance is that many of these veterans are not receiving the care, right? If we think about just around the issue of veteran suicide, some of the statistics as we talk about 22 veterans, commit suicide, that when you look at those numbers, really only about 6 or so are being treated in a VA facility. So a large portion, let's say, of this population who suffer from serious issues and needs, right, to the point where they feel their only recourse is to take their life, they're not being served or treated in an institution. So we need to make sure that they can get support no matter where they are. If they don't have access to a VA facility, we need to give them better treatment. But then the other piece that I would say, just in general, back to making sure that we send in the special forces and we have a greater coalition, we do, there are almost 50,000 veteran service organizations, 501c3s, that are trying to support the veteran community. Now, it's great to see that there are so many people who want to help, but unfortunately, that 50,000 is somewhat fragmented. There is no consistency, there's not continuity, and unfortunately, you've got all of these people who are maybe trying to do good things that are not having the impact that they need to have. And so, to your point, we've got to do a better job of kind of galvanizing ourselves and really focusing down to, a few big impact things and look at the infrastructure that we need to make better improvement for a group that sacrificed so much for us. We need to do better for them.
Well, you are right on with the fact that we're only capturing a small percentage of those veterans who need help. And I want to draw our listeners' attention to the fact that so many of our veterans are civilian soldiers. They're Guard and Reserves.
Right.
And when they return home from the battlefield, they ask them to fill out a questionnaire. And they ask them, have you experienced trauma, post-traumatic stress, or TBI? In many instances, I've heard from many of my friends in the Guard and Reserve that they won't say yes because it'll mean that they have to be held back for another month for further screening. And they've been away from their family long enough. They want to get right home. And so they get back. Now they're covered, not by the VA, but by their employer. But their employer doesn't recognize that they're veterans because it's not like they wear their veteran hat on them. And the employer doesn't always put sufficient mental health basic coverage in their basic health plan.
Yeah.
So in many cases, the insurance companies for these major Fortune 500 companies, when they're not parity compliant, meaning they're not ensuring equal coverage, they're actually discriminating against our veterans because the veterans that are in those places, workplaces, are disproportionately affected by these invisible wounds of war. And it's upon us to make sure they get that care, whether they're getting it at the VA or whether they're getting it through their civilian guaranteed health benefits as protected under law. And that's why we've got to be pushing at all levers. And for people who care about veterans, it's not just pushing at the VA. It's pushing these ERISA plans, these third-party administration health plans to make sure they're complying with equal coverage, because how do they know which ones of their members are our heroes? Which ones? They can't go through and know. They just got to know that they've got to do the right thing, because there will be a big toll for our veterans. And if they're not guaranteeing equal coverage, the veterans in those places of employment are going to be the ones that are paying the biggest price for what they did for us, frankly, in serving our country.
Patrick, I would say, when you think about Johnson & Johnson, our founders, General Robert Wood Johnson, right, one of the Johnson brothers, our company is named after, served. And our company for more than 120 years has partnered, have had veterans, supported the military. It has been integral to our DNA. And frankly, when you think about our credo, which is our statement of values that we have within Johnson & Johnson, and the responsibilities that we have to customers, patients, our employees, the communities in which we live and work. And then, when we do a great job in those three areas, then we return a good return to our shareholders. But one of those, commitments, as I mentioned in our credo, is really to do a better job in serving our military and supporting them. And as a veteran myself, I'm going to ask for two things. One is, veterans, as you transition out of active duty, I would ask you to consider self-identifying, because when Patrick, as you described, sometimes the companies don't know who served in the Guard and Reserve, who served on active duty and have since gotten out, and consequently, their support systems, their HR systems, their policies, the insurance benefits, so on and so forth, because they don't know that they have this population. Unless you self-identify as a veteran, it does not create more of a need or requirement within whatever company. So I'm a strong advocate to ask our military, those who are serving in the Guard and Reserve, as well as our veterans, to make sure that you're self-identifying, be proud of the service that you provided to your country, but also too, and one of the reasons why they're reluctant, so this is where I ask for companies like mine and others around the country, is to ensure that you're not actually, for those who sacrifice and serve, don't hold that against them negatively. Because why do some veterans don't self-identify? They're saying, well, wait, am I going to get hired if they think I'm going to go, once a month, I got to go to duty and I've got, Guard or Reserve duty that I have to do. Or I might be called up to serve and I'm going to be away. Is the company going to be mad that I'm going to get called up to serve? Are they going to support my family when I'm gone? Are my benefits going to be cut? And frankly, we looked at many of our policies, even though I would say we've had great policies for many, many years. We did more than what the government required. But I would say we even took a stronger look and we doubled down and we said, we needed to do even better than that. And so I would ask other companies to reassess some of your policies, look at what you're doing, make sure that you're taking care of those who serve. Because often some of the governmental requirements, when you're just meeting the bare minimums, those bare minimums are not enough. And so we need to do better there. And then as a result of those people, and I'm sorry, Marjorie, as a result of having better understanding of your population and also making sure that your voice is heard, it's there where we can change policy. It's there where we can make improvements in the HR processes, in our insurance programs. Frankly, and when I look at it, like I said, we had great programs, but frankly, we had some great, folks who were vocal, were brave and courageous, the things that made you great in the military. They did that same thing and they voiced their concerns. And frankly, our company responded and said, we're going to do even better. So I would encourage more to do the same. Marjorie, you're going to say something.
Yeah, I really appreciate this conversation. Being someone who's spent, I guess, a decade or more in the military mental health space, this is all very near and dear to my heart. I've also seen a lot of change for the better. And I really have. And it's not where it should be or could be. But when I think about having these conversations 15 years ago to now, we've really come a long way. And mental health is part of just the resiliency piece, is part of the, the conversation with the military. It's also hard. It's hard because they are, kind of hired to do a mission and they're focused. And, there's a lot of nuances that I think make it all really difficult. It's interesting. We just made a hire of someone we've been a really great person who we've been working with, a female. Before we even hired her, she was a strategic partner that we worked with one of our partners. And I just found out that she's an 18-year Army veteran, an 8-year. She was in the military for 8 years prior to her civilian career. Never said anything. So she wouldn't fall in that category of didn't share because she's going to drill in the reserves. But I think it was more of didn't share because of the stigma that people might put on her, which is part of the problem when we're talking about removing stigma, coming out, talking about, these issues. Then all of a sudden, are people going to think that all veterans are crazy and they all have PTSD and they're, violent? And then, it goes back to what Patrick and I are so passionate about mental health literacy is the truth is about PTSD is most people with it are not violent. They're more isolated and they're staying home and they're not seeing people and they don't want to go out. And so we just have a lot of times the wrong information, and education is key to that. I want to also commend Johnson & Johnson and Janssen for the ERGs that you put together and the support. I mean, I know that you've been big advocates. I appreciate that you brought up the 50,000 different nonprofits. It's confusing. It's very confusing for people where to go. And it usually comes from a veteran who had an experience and says, I'm going to create an organization to make it better so no one has to experience this. It comes from a good place, but there's not as much collaboration going on that could be. I want to pivot, if you don't mind, really quickly to another thing that Johnson & Johnson's done. As far as I know, was the first corporation that we know. You also created an ERG for mental health. And I wonder if you could talk a little bit about that, because I just think it's such an incredible way to kind of get that messaging out there.
So we created an ERG. They're called the Mental Health Diplomats. And it is one of our fastest growing ERGs globally in all of Johnson & Johnson. We have 130,000 employees, and I think we have more than 2,500 or so members of the mental health diplomats. And the great thing with this employee resource group is they, when you think about it, we all know the statistics, right? 1 in 4 of us are affected by a mental health need, right? Either directly or either from a loved one, that we have in common. So 1 in 4. And so when you think about the prevalence of mental health and the needs that we have in that space, there's certainly a need for more education, more advocacy, more support, and better systems and processes. And so this resource group, they provide support. It's almost like internally we have our own mini advocacy organization within Johnson & Johnson. So this team is able to better educate, caregivers that are caring for people with serious mental illnesses or that have mental health disorders and some of the needs that they have, those who've gone through trauma themselves and what we need to do better, right? So we're educating ourselves internally. And as a result of that education, we're becoming a better company. We're erasing some of the stigma that's out there. We've got a lot of brave people who are sharing brave stories. And then as a result, folks are saying, wow, I didn't know, I didn't understand, I didn't know what I didn't know. And then the support systems that we have. So when I look at we have our employee assistance program, where we have counselors and different people that the type of education and support that they provide. When we think about some of the benefits that we have, now those groups are being even educated further around specifically what sort of services and support our employee population requires and needs. So it's great. I would encourage those who don't have a resource group like that is to perhaps, one, create an environment where people feel comfortable enough to come forward and form that, create a safe space, right? Remove that stigma where then the conversations can happen. I would also say support them with trained professionals, which we've done, who have education, right? And also are trained in the space so that sometimes, as people with good intention says, hey, I started doing this and this is what I treated. Oh, wait a minute, that's not an approved treatment. So you want to make sure that you've got, trained professionals that are providing information and resources to your employees. But I would say we've had phenomenal results from this resource group.
I mean, I hope everyone listening to this, if they could see you, I'm sure some of our YouTube followers can see, they'd see someone who is in it to win it. Courtney, you've never lost that esprit de corps, and you're about action. You're already kind of helping us, instruct us. How do we make our world better in our own place of business and work? It's just so uplifting at a time when people are suffering from so much, negativity in our body politic and the stress of the environment, you have this enthusiasm for helping others that is so palpable, and it's the reason why we're honored to be friends and know you, because we need people like you in more places. And we were so glad that you were able to join us, and so people get to know you like we have just a little bit. And I think Marjorie will give the final question. Sorry for eating up all the time.
Well, one thing I would just say is, when I look across all of us here on the phone, I would say one part of it comes from, our own values, right? Some which were instilled by our family, our parents, who created this calling to serve, but also to a mandate to be the change that you want to see, right? Don't sit on the sidelines and just complain about it. Do something about it. And I think about that, I hear my parents talking and, in my ears here, saying that over and over, be the change you want to see. Don't sit back and complain. And so I hopefully am trying to embody that. I know as we work together and have in many ways and shapes and forms, that's why I enjoy working with all of you, because you embody that same spirit. Psych Hub is a part of that. You're helping to empower people to help themselves.
Well, we're going to wrap up with one last question for you. And this one's just kind of free flowing, but if you had a magic wand and you could do anything to make the future of mental health a better place, what would you love to see?
I'd love to see, the issue that we talked about at the beginning. I'd like to see more innovation and investment that actually gets to the point of empowering people and making a difference in their lives. Again, we've talked about the disparities that exist in treatment. We talk about the fact that there's not parity when you think about the treatment of mental health. And we know about many of the key causes to that and the social determinants that exist in care. Those things I would like to fundamentally see change. If I reflect back on this last year, right, and what the pandemic has taught me, one of the things that I appreciate the most is I appreciate the little things that I frankly took for granted pre-pandemic, right? I appreciate my family, my friends, all of those things so much more, like the ability to go to my favorite restaurant when I want to go to and the way that I want to go to, the ability to hug somebody, like all of those things, right? I now appreciate so much more. When I think about in the space of mental health and some of the issues that people who have serious mental illnesses have to deal with, that they really don't need to, because either solutions are there, but they're not receiving that treatment, or they don't have access to the treatment, or either because of our systems, affordability, access, you name it, and we need to do our part, right? But there needs to be an overhaul that frankly creates better access to higher quality care for those who need it most. That is where I would put my wand.
I love it, because that's exactly where I would say Psych Hub is right aligned with that, which is why we love working with you, Courtney, and Janssen and the team. And just, to echo Patrick as well, thank you. Thank you for being such a great leader, because it, you're making such a difference both internally and externally. And as we want to see, mental health just continue to get better, it's just great to have someone like you at the helm. So thank you. And thanks for joining us.
Thank you for having me. And in closing, I would just say, I am optimistic, in spite of the pandemic and in spite of the issues that we've seen with racism and social justice issues that pervade our country, right? I'm still very, very optimistic. I believe in our spirit. I believe in what we can do when we come together. And so it's going to be critical for us to do that going forward. But when we do bring all of the great minds and knowledge that we have and all the great resources, we can make a huge difference. And so for that, I appreciate coming together with Psych Hub, because I do feel good about the difference that we're making together as partners, certainly 1 + 1 is adding up to 3, 4, and 5 when you bring us together.
Love it. I love it.
Hey everyone, it is your friendly neighborhood Kevin Hines, and here is your brain health tip of the week. Be caring to yourself and to others. You know what depletes you and what recharges you. Make sure you block off time on your calendar every single day for yourself, whether that's doing self-care or investing in your personal or professional development. If you're the go-to person for offering help or a listening ear, remember, you can't help others unless you're helping yourself first. Take that first step in learning more about your mental health by checking out Psych Hub's Mental Health Ally Certification Program. Learn more at psychhub.com/learning.
As always, thank you for listening to our podcast.
If you enjoyed the show, drop us a review.
If you haven't already, subscribe to our podcast for the latest episodes.
For the latest insights, check us out at psychhub.com.